Good evening, and welcome in the name of Jesus. Grace and peace to you. Tonight we gather to hear the story of the Passion. I would invite you to consider that what you're about to hear and to see is about the perspective of bearing witness. As one of the great spirituals asks us, were you there? That is a question of witness, a question of what did you see? What did you hear? Were you there? It's a question of bearing witness, of perspective. To this end, tonight's service will include images, the perspectives of artists who have shared their vision of what transpired. We will also hear the perspectives of songwriters and musicians. These witnesses are here to help us come closer to the gospel story, to experience it afresh, and to see it and to hear it more clearly. The four gospels each have their own story of the Passion. They each bring their own perspective, and I have done my best to bring together their points of view into a single story. It is an interpretation. This means that what you are about to hear will not track with just one of the gospels. It would be hard to follow along with in your Bibles. That being said, almost every single word comes from Scripture. Last, I would like to offer a special word of thanks to tonight's readers. Pay close attention to them. They are your storytellers this evening. Without their unique voices, each one carrying the perspective of wonderful personality, this service would be far less interesting and far less a labor of love, brought to you by a church family working together to bear witness to Jesus while sailing these uncharted waters. If you would like more information about this service, I invite you to look at the resources attached to this video below for the names of our readers, a complete transcript of the readings, as well as information about tonight's music. Let us prepare our hearts in worship to keep watch with Jesus and to follow where he leads us.
Jesus went out with his disciples, as was his custom, across the Kidron Valley to the Mount of Olives, to a place called Gethsemane, where there was an olive press and a garden. And he said to his disciples, "Sit here and pray that you may not come into the time of trial." He took with him Peter and James and John and began to be distressed and agitated. Then he said to them, "I am deeply grieved, even to death. Remain here and stay awake with me." Then he withdrew from them a little farther, about a stone's throw, and collapsing on the ground, he prayed, "Abba, Father, for you all things are possible. If you are willing, let this cup pass from me. Yet not my will, but yours be done." Then an angel from heaven appeared to him and gave him strength. In his anguish he prayed more earnestly, and his sweat became like great drops of blood falling down on the ground. When he got up from prayer, he came to the disciples and found them heavy with sleep because of grief. And he said to them, "Why are you sleeping? Could you not stay awake with me 1 hour? Enough. The hour has come, and the Son of Man is betrayed into the hands of sinners. Get up. Let us be going. See, my betrayer is at hand."
While he was still speaking, Judas, one of the 12, arrived, leading a large crowd. Judas also knew the garden, because Jesus often met there with his disciples. So Judas brought a detachment of soldiers together with police from the chief priests, the scribes, and the elders of the people, and they came there with lanterns and torches and swords and clubs. Judas had given them a sign, saying, "The one that I will kiss is the man. Arrest him and lead him away under guard." At once he came up to Jesus and said, "Greetings, Rabbi," and kissed him. Jesus said to him, "Judas, is it with a kiss that you are betraying the Son of Man? Friend, do what you are here to do." Then Jesus came forward and asked the crowd, "Whom are you looking for?" They answered, "Jesus of Nazareth." Jesus replied, "I am he." When he said this, they stepped back and fell to the ground. Again he said to them, "I told you that I am he. So if you are looking for me, let these men go." Then they came and laid hands on Jesus. Suddenly Peter, who was standing with Jesus, put his hand on his sword, drew it, and struck the slave of the high priest, cutting off his right ear. Then Jesus said to Peter, "No more of this. Put your sword back into its place. For all who take the sword will perish by the sword. Do you think that I cannot appeal to my Father, and he will at once send me more than 12 legions of angels?" And he touched the ear of the slave who was wounded and healed him. Then Jesus said to the chief priests, the officers of the temple police, and the elders who had come for him, "Have you come out with swords and clubs to arrest me as though I were a bandit? Day after day I was with you in the temple teaching, and you did not lay hands on me. But this is your hour and the power of darkness." So the soldiers, their officer, and the police arrested Jesus and bound him. Then all the disciples deserted him and fled.
Road to dark Gethsemane, feel the tempter's power. Your Redeemer's conflict see, watch with him 1 hour. Turn not from his griefs away, oh, turn not from his griefs. Learn of Jesus Christ to pray, oh, turn not from his griefs. See him at the judgment hall, beaten, bound, arrayed. All the wormwood and the gall, the pains his soul sustained. Shun not suffering and shame, oh, shun not suffering. Learn of Christ to bear the cross, oh, shun not suffering.
Those who had arrested Jesus took him to Caiaphas, the high priest, in whose house the scribes and elders had gathered. Now Peter was following Jesus at a distance, as far as the courtyard of the high priest, and, going inside, he sat with the guards in order to see how this would end. The slaves and the police had a charcoal fire because it was cold, and they were standing around it, warming themselves. And Peter also came and stood with them, warming himself by the fire. Then a servant girl, seeing Peter in the firelight, stared at him and said, "This man also was with him. You also were with Jesus, the Galilean." But Peter denied it before all of them, saying, "Woman, I do not know him. I do not know what you are talking about." Then Peter went out to the porch, and another servant girl saw him. And she said to the bystanders, "This man was with Jesus of Nazareth." They asked him, "You are not also one of his disciples, are you?" Again he denied it with an oath, "I am not. I do not know the man."
Now, inside the whole assembly of the elders of the people, both chief priests and scribes brought Jesus to their council before Caiaphas the high priest. Caiaphas was the one who had advised the council that it was better to have one person die for the people than to have the whole nation destroyed. They were looking for testimony against Jesus so that they might put him to death, but they found none, for many gave false testimony against him, but their testimony did not agree. Then the high priest questioned Jesus about his disciples and about his teaching. Jesus answered, "I have spoken openly to the world. I have always taught in synagogues and in the temple. I have said nothing in secret. Why do you ask me? Ask those who heard what I said to them. They know what I said." When he said this, one of the police standing nearby struck Jesus on the face, saying, "Is that how you answer the high priest?" Jesus answered, "If I have spoken wrongly, testify to the wrong. But if I have spoken rightly, why do you strike me?" Then the high priest said to him, "I put you under oath before the living God. Tell us, are you the Messiah, the Son of God?" He replied, "If I tell you, you will not believe. And if I question you, you will not answer. But from now on, you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming with the clouds of heaven." All of them asked, "Are you then the Son of God?" Jesus said, "I am." Then the high priest tore his clothes and said, "He has blasphemed. You have heard it from his own lips. Why do we still need witnesses? What is your verdict?" They answered, "He deserves death." Then they spat in his face and mocked him. The men who were holding Jesus blindfolded him and began to beat him, saying, "Prophesy to us, Messiah. Who is it that struck you?" Then the assembly rose as a body, bound Jesus, and led him away to Pilate's headquarters.
And as they were going out, the bystanders came up and said to Peter, "Certainly you are also one of his disciples. You too are a Galilean. Your accent betrays you." One of the slaves of the high priest, a relative of the man whose ear Peter had cut off, asked, "Did I not see you in the garden with him?" Then Peter began to invoke a curse on himself and to swear, "I do not know the man. I do not know what you are talking about." At that moment, while he was still speaking, the cock crowed, and the Lord turned and looked at Peter. Then Peter remembered the word of the Lord, how he had said to him, "Before the cock crows today, you will deny me 3 times." And Peter went out, and he broke down and wept bitterly.
Now it was early in the morning, and Jesus stood before Pilate, the Roman governor, at his headquarters. And Pilate turned to the assembly of the chief priests and elders of the people and said, "What accusation do you bring against this man?" They answered, "If this man were not a criminal, we would not have handed him over to you." And they began to accuse Jesus of many things, saying, "This man stirs up the people by teaching throughout all Judea, from Galilee, where he began, even to this place. We found him perverting our nation, forbidding us to pay taxes to the emperor, and saying that he himself is the Messiah, a king." Then Pilate said to Jesus, "What do you say to this?" But Jesus gave no answer, not to a single charge, so that Pilate was greatly amazed.
Then Pilate summoned Jesus into his headquarters and asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Jesus answered, "Do you ask this on your own, or did others tell you about me?" Pilate replied, "I am not a Jew, am I? Your own nation and the chief priests have handed you over to me. What have you done?" Jesus answered, "My kingdom is not from this world. If my kingdom were from this world, my followers would be fighting to keep me from being handed over. But as it is, my kingdom is not from here." Pilate asked him, "So you are a king?" Jesus answered, "You say that I am a king. I was born to testify to the truth, and for this I came into the world. Everyone who belongs to the truth listens to my voice." Pilate asked him, "What is truth?" Then Pilate asked him, "Where are you from?" But Jesus gave him no answer. Pilate therefore said to him, "Do you refuse to speak to me? Don't you know that I have the power to release you and the power to crucify you?" Jesus answered him, "You would have no power over me unless it had been given to you from above." From that moment on, Pilate wanted to release him.
Now at the festival, the governor used to release a prisoner for the crowd, anyone they wanted. And at that time they had a notorious prisoner, a bandit called Jesus Barabbas, a man who had been put in prison with the rebels for an insurrection that had taken place in the city and who had committed murder. So Pilate called together the chief priests, the leaders, and the people, and said to them, "You brought me this man, Jesus, as one who was perverting the people, but I find no basis for accusation. But you have a custom that I release someone for you at the Passover. Whom do you want me to release for you? Jesus Barabbas, or Jesus who is called Messiah?"
The chief priests and the elders stirred up the crowds and persuaded them to ask for Barabbas and to have Jesus killed. So they shouted in reply, "Barabbas! Release for us Barabbas!" Pilate asked them, "Then what should I do with Jesus, who is called Messiah?" All of them said, "Let him be crucified." But Pilate asked, "Why? What evil has he done? I have found in him no ground for the sentence of death." But they shouted, "Away with him! We have a law, and according to that law he ought to die because he has claimed to be the Son of God. Let him be crucified."
Then Pilate sat down on the judge's bench at a place called the Stone Pavement, and he said to the crowds, "Look, I'm bringing him out to you to let you know that I have examined him, and I have not found him guilty of any of your charges." And bringing Jesus out, Pilate said to the people, "Here is the man." When the chief priests and the police saw him, they shouted, "Crucify him! Crucify him!" Pilate asked them, "Shall I crucify your king?" They answered, "We have no king but the emperor. Everyone who claims to be a king sets himself against the emperor. If you release this man, you're no friend of the emperor." Now when Pilate heard this, he was more afraid than ever, and they kept urgently demanding with loud shouts that Jesus be crucified, and their voices prevailed.
So when Pilate saw he could do nothing, but rather that a riot was beginning, he took some water and washed his hands before the crowd, saying, "I am innocent of this man's blood. See to it yourselves." Then the people as a whole answered, "His blood be on us and on our children." So Pilate, wishing to satisfy the crowd, gave his verdict that their demand should be granted. He released Barabbas, the man they asked for, the one who had been put in prison for insurrection and murder, and after flogging Jesus, Pilate handed him over to be crucified.
The soldiers led Jesus into the courtyard of the governor's headquarters, and they gathered the whole cohort around him. They stripped him and put a purple robe on him, and after twisting some thorns into a crown, they put it on his head. They put a reed in his right hand and knelt before him in a mocking salute, saying, "Hail, King of the Jews!" They spat on him, and taking the reed out of his hand, they struck him on the face and continued beating him. Then they led him away to crucify him. As they went out, they seized a man, Simon of Cyrene, the father of Alexander and Rufus, who was coming from the country. And they laid the cross on him and compelled him to carry it behind Jesus. Two others who were also criminals were led away to be put to death with Jesus, and they came to the place that is called Golgotha, which means the place of the skull. And they crucified Jesus there with the criminals, one on his right, the other on his left. And Jesus said, "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing." When the soldiers had crucified Jesus, they divided his clothes among themselves. Now his tunic was seamless, woven in one piece from the top. So the soldiers said to one another, "Let us not tear it, but cast lots to see who will get it." And over his head, the soldiers put the charge against him, an inscription that Pilate had ordered to be written, which read, "Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews." And many of the people read this inscription because the place where Jesus was crucified was near the city. Then the soldiers sat down and kept watch over Jesus. It was 9 o'clock in the morning.
Those who passed by derided him, shaking their heads and saying, "Aha! You who would destroy the temple and build it in 3 days, save yourself. If you are the Son of God, come down from the cross." In the same way, the chief priests also, along with the scribes and the elders, were mocking him, saying, "He saved others. He cannot save himself. Let the Messiah, the King of Israel, come down from the cross now, and we will believe in him. If he is God's son, God's chosen one, let God deliver him, if he wants to." The soldiers also mocked him, coming up and saying, "If you are the King of the Jews, save yourself." One of the criminals who were hanged there kept deriding him and saying, "Are you not the Messiah? Save yourself and us." But the other rebuked him, saying, "Do you not fear God, since you are under the same sentence of condemnation? And we indeed have been condemned justly, for we are getting what we deserve for our deeds. But this man has done nothing wrong." Then he said, "Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom." And Jesus replied, "Truly I tell you, today you will be with me in paradise." Meanwhile, standing near the cross of Jesus were his mother and Mary Magdalene and Salome, the mother of the sons of Zebedee, all the women who had followed him from Galilee and who had provided for him. When Jesus saw his mother and the disciple whom he loved standing beside her, he said to his mother, "Woman, here is your son." Then he said to the disciple, "Here is your mother." And from that hour, the disciple took her into his own home.
When it was noon, the sun's light failed, and the darkness came over the whole land until 3 in the afternoon. At 3 o'clock, Jesus cried out with a loud voice, "Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani," which means, my God, why have you forsaken me?" When some of the bystanders heard it, they said, "Listen, he's calling for Elijah." And others said, "Wait, let us see whether Elijah will come to save him." After this, when Jesus knew the time had come, he said, "I am thirsty." A jar of sour wine was standing there, so they put a sponge full of the wine on the branch of hyssop and held it to his mouth. When Jesus had received the wine, he said, "It is finished." Then Jesus cried out again with a loud voice, and he said, "Father, into your hands I commend my spirit." And then he breathed his last. At that moment, the curtain of the temple was torn in two. From top to bottom, the earth shook and the rocks were split. Now, when the centurion, who was keeping watch over Jesus, saw the way he breathed his last, and the earthquake and all that took place, he was terrified. He praised God and said, "Truly, this man was innocent. Truly, he was God's son."
Since it was the day of preparation, the elders of the people did not want the bodies left on the cross during the Sabbath. So they asked Pilate to have the legs of the crucified men broken and the bodies removed. Then the soldiers came and broke the legs of the first and of the other who had been crucified with him. But when they came to Jesus, they saw that he was already dead. They did not break his legs. Instead, one of the soldiers pierced his side with a spear, and at once blood and water came out. This was just as it is written, "They will look on the one whom they have pierced." And when all the crowds who had gathered there for this spectacle saw what had taken place, they returned home, beating their breasts. But all his acquaintances, including the women who had followed him from Galilee, stood at a distance watching these things. When it was evening, there came a good and righteous man named Joseph, who, though a respected member of the Jewish council, had not agreed to their plan and action. He came from the town of Arimathea and was also himself a disciple of Jesus, waiting expectantly for the kingdom of God. He went boldly to Pilate and asked for the body of Jesus, and Pilate ordered his body to be given over. Nicodemus, a Pharisee who had at first come to Jesus by night, also came, bringing a mixture of myrrh and aloes. They took the body of Jesus and wrapped it with spices in linen cloths, according to the burial custom of the Jews. And they laid it in a new tomb, which was hewn in rock. They rolled a great stone against the door of the tomb and went away. Mary Magdalene and the other women who had come with Jesus from Galilee were also there, sitting opposite the tomb, and they saw how his body was laid. Then they returned home, and on the Sabbath they rested according to the commandment.
Wondrous love is this, oh my soul, oh my soul. What wondrous love is this, oh my soul. What wondrous love is this that caused the Lord of bliss to bear the dreadful curse for my soul, for my soul. To bear the dreadful curse for my soul. And when from death I'm free, I'll sing on, I'll sing on. And when from death I'm free, I'll sing on. And when from death I'm free, I'll sing joyful be. Through all eternity, I'll sing on, I'll sing on. Through all eternity,